Okay, we should be alive, ladies and gentlemen. Good day. I am Bunzert of Radio Retrofuture, as always, and today with me I have a very special guest, a award-winning writer, Sean Marsh, if I'm correct.
Yes, that's the name, Sean Marsh. Thank you.
Okay, but not award-winning. I thought you also won an award with something, or did I read that wrong? Can you hear me, Sean? Oh,
Yeah, I can hear you.
okay. There's a delay. Okay, that happens.
Yeah. hmm
Writer Sean Marsh is with me today. He wrote a kid's book that I forgot to grab with me, but it's called Little Wade and Watchtower, and we're gonna talk about the day and what inspired him to write it. Let's get acquainted with Sean here, and let's start with like who he is, what he does, and how did he end up here.
Thanks for having me. I sincerely appreciate it. Um, I guess the proper way to start is I want to tell a story of something that happened many, 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 many years ago. I actually was born in New York City and spent the majority of my childhood on the Lower East Side. I went to school down in the Village and spent most of my time down the Lower East Side. And one night, I was actually coming home late from a basketball game, and the bus broke down, and I had to walk home for quite a long time. Now, this was back in the '80s in New York City, when New York City was patchier than it was today. There were nice neighborhoods and not so nice neighborhoods, and a lot of places in between. And as I was walking home, unfortunately, I was dressed in all of my gear, including my basketball shoes and everything else. And I caught the attention of a local gang, small group of people, about 6 people, and they spotted me, and I started to run. I was several blocks away from home, and I figured that hopefully I could make it. And so I sprinted as fast as I could. Now, the thing about New York is it's pretty patchy. And the other thing about New York, which a lot of people don't know, is this is on Manhattan Island, is that on every single block, blocks either, when you have an intersection of streets and avenues, it's either the front of a building or the back of a building. And sometimes it's a mix of both. So I ran and I ran and I ran. And finally, I came around the corner, but they intercepted me. And it was me against 6 people. And I didn't know what to do. I was very, very young at the time. And then right when I thought, do I run? Do I try to fight? What do I do? Suddenly, behind me, I didn't notice this, but there was a loading dock for the back of one of these big office buildings. And the gate suddenly threw open. And 2 men came out. One was extremely tall, African American, and never said a word. And the other one was this very, 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 very short. I learned later he was half Puerto Rican, half Italian, who was incredibly verbose. And they came out, and they clearly saw that I was in trouble. And the shorter one and the louder one just yelled out a lot of profanity, which I will not repeat here. And he said, get out of here, get out of here. And they quickly scared them off. A combination of the little one's loudness and the tall one's just sheer stature scared them off. And then, obviously, I was incredibly relieved. And what they did was they basically walked me home, and for the several blocks after that. And as they walked home, they were asking me, hey, how you doing? Are you okay? You know, what happened? They tell me all about it. And one spoke a lot, and the other one didn't say a word. He just walked forward and was constantly kind of looking around for any danger. Everything was fine. And they walked me home. And as I was about to enter into my apartment building, I realized that they sort of sent me off with it, hey, man, we're New Yorkers, we take care of our own. Mm-hmm. And then they turned and left. And right when I was about to enter my apartment building, I realized I hadn't asked them their names. And then I rushed back out to see them, and they were gone. And I actually tried to find them again. I went back to the building again to try to find them, and I never found them again. And this is back in the 80s, before the internet, before you could possibly do anything to track people down in that manner. But I never forgot them. And the thing about Manhattan Island, which is very interesting, is it's an island with really long avenues that stretch, especially at night, seemingly infinitely for miles. And I ran out. My building was on 2nd Avenue, which is one of the longest avenues. and I looked out, and this was quite late at night, and they were gone, and the city was just this infinite row of street lamps.
Wow.
And there was something really magical about that. In New York City at the time, for me, at that time, but also I think perpetually, is this wonderful mix of danger and wonder. It's dirty, but it's also magnificent. And that moment just stayed with me for years and years and years. And I never forgot these people that helped me.
I mean,
and it's a reminder that New York, despite its immense size, it can feel very impersonal, but then suddenly personal in an instant.
Yeah.
I never forgot them. And then over the years, in terms of, I did what any person did. I began to read a lot, and I was interested in fantasy. I was always interested in writing. And very quickly, my favorite novel, I remember in one summer when I was younger, I read all of Jules Verne and all of H.G. Wells all in one go. And I thought, this is incredible. This is the best stuff I've ever read, ever. And what's so interesting and I started to research 19th century New York. And I realized that New York has this incredible history. And especially during the 19th century, it's when most of the institutions that we know today were actually born. The financial markets, the fire department, the police department, all of these things that we take for the first millionaires were born in many ways, and billionaires were born out of New York's Gilded Age. And I thought this is a city with incredible history, but also there's a mythic aspect to it as well.
Oh, yeah.
And then the other inspiration that sort of inspired Little Wade and Watchtower was my brother. My brother and I grew up on the streets of New York together for many, many years. He was a few years older than I was. And unfortunately, my brother, he died early in life. He died in his early 30s from a terminal illness that he tried desperately to beat, but couldn't. And over the years, I always wanted to be an author. I couldn't quite come up with the right idea. And I was a teacher for a long time. I taught. I was an in-home tutor. I worked with disabled kids. I worked with kids at risk youth. Public school, private school, etc. And what I kept running into was kids wanted to read something that was, because they knew that they had to read stuff that was educational for them. They knew that they got it, they understood it, but they wanted to read something that was educational but also entertaining at the same time. They wanted to be thrilled, they wanted to be scared, they wanted to care, but they also wanted to learn. They wanted wisdom from their the books that they read. Mm-hmm. And so I got to thinking, and then when I talked to teachers were also equally, they had sort of an equal amount of consternation. They were trying to find books that the kids would read and just flip through and enjoy, but that also left them with lessons, with good vocabulary, that where the material hits that sort of that sweet spot between innocence and danger. And I thought long and hard about this, and I really wanted to do something both for teachers and for students, and this is after 20 years of experience. And then one night, I had this very, very, very vivid dream where I'm walking down the streets of New York, and I can tell that it's New York because New York has always I get the feel of that place whenever I'm there. And I saw this amazing image of this little girl with red hair and holding the hand of a very, 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 very tall mechanical giant with a top hat with a face like a lamppost. Awesome. And next to both of them was this little boy dressed in sort of very old-fashioned, almost Regency clothing, floating above the ground. And it just hit me as a bolt from the blue. And because the way it works is Little Wade and Watchtower is sort of a synthesis of all of those inspirations at once. Because when I think about my brother, for example, my brother never got a chance to live his life fully. Mm-hmm. I kept working with kids that never got to live the kind of life that they always wanted to live. Something went wrong. They lost a parent, or their parents got divorced, or they suffered an illness, or something happened that threw them off track, and they saw other people living the life they wanted to live. Yeah. And they struggled with that, and they were very, very sad. And I wanted to create something inspirational for kids that takes them into the darkness, but gives them a light to sort of shine the way, and then takes them out of it.
Oh,
and all of that, steampunk, New York, trying to honor my brother's memory, what teachers want, what kids want, just came together in that one dream, and I woke up and I started writing. And the result is the book series Little Wade and Watchtower, which is about a sort of a pair of supernatural heroes that patrol the streets of New York City. They've been doing so since 1831, and they help kids in need. Only kids can see them. Only kids are allowed to see them. They charge nothing for their services. They say the only fee is secrecy. And that's the genesis of Little Wade and Watchtower. And the book one of the series is called Abigail and the Great Gang Trap. And it's the story of a young girl named Abigail Reed who lives on the streets of New York in 1899. And she's brand new to the city. She's just moved in from the country. She's just lost her mother. Her father works 3 jobs to support them. She's very, very poor. And just like I did, I suffered way back then as a kid. She's walking home one night and she gets accosted by one of the local gangs called the Long Shadows. And they chase after her. And sure enough, a pair of strangers come to her aid. And it's from that moment when they reveal themselves to her that they ask her, would you like to become our next client? She, of course, says yes. And they do what they always do, which is they choose a child in need, and they offer to solve that child's problems. They make a list, they make a contract. They're very gentlemanly and very official and very professional. And they figure out, what is it that you need? And Abigail, this happens on Friday night, and Abigail says, well, I would like to walk home. I would like to walk to school on Monday morning without being afraid. Okay. So essentially what follows is the first of 3 adventures they're going to have, and it's called Abigail and the Great Gang Trap. So step 1 is, now we need to solve your gang problem. So that's essentially, that is the genesis and the sort of the nutshell description of Little Wade and Watchtower 1, Abigail and the Great Gang Trap.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there is a lot to take out of that. Well, one of the things that I notice, especially with a lot of aspiring writers, they have, such a big issue with like coming up with ideas for the story. I want to write about something, and then they come up with these extremely large and convoluted worlds with all these complex systems. And you're listening to all the background because, of course, they didn't write the story. They wrote all the background, and you're listening to it. You're not interested because it's like hearing about a tourist trap in a country that does not exist. So, but you have no idea what it's like, right? And when I talk with writers, like, what happened to you last week? And then they'll come up with some weird story, and you're like, why don't you just write about that? No, you don't have to build the world. You can just, write about that. And yeah, well, I recognize, like, the entire process where you take, like, your life's experiences and just combine them in the most unpredictable ways. Which for me is also, like, what steampunk essentially is. You put things together that are not supposed to go along together.
I think what's so fascinating about the genre in particular is this idea of innocence and engineering and reinvention. And there's something innocent about steampunk, about the 19th century, about where manners still matter, where being a gentleman still matters, and where you can have an adventure with no profanity, no swearing, nothing inappropriate for that parents would object to or teachers could object or anything else. But yet you can take readers on an adventure into the supernatural, into science fiction, into fantasy, and it all blends together amazingly well, because in the 19th century, that's when the big explosion happened. You had the penny dreadfuls for horror, you had detective fiction for Sherlock Holmes, you had science fiction for H.G. Wells and Jules Verne. You had a lot of the great romances came out of that. A lot of the great crime novels came out of that. So steampunk, in a way, once you bring someone into that world, and I try to keep it pretty simple. This is basically realistic New York, and these characters are out there, and they're undercover. It's just behind the surface. So that way, for me, it's carriages, it's top hats, they intersect with real life events. But for kids, for kids, the world is still sort of a magical place
Yeah.
in many ways, and that's sort of the tension that I wanted to go for, because very quickly it can start with gangs, but then it can move into the supernatural very easily, and then seamlessly go into fantasy. And Abigail is an extremely well-read young girl, so her vocabulary is very advanced, and she knows quite a bit of science. She's learned quite a bit of science, and I found out that in 19th century classrooms, the kids actually did quite a bit of science experiments in classrooms that actually wouldn't be allowed today, because they're kind of unsafe, but they were incredible for their time. Let's mix these things together and find out what's going on. But the result was there was a kind of sort of a scrappy Wild West quality to their education. I kept finding with kids, I kept talking to them, was they wanted their education to be an adventure. And I found that with steampunk, you can do that. You can make informing people and educating them and bringing them into a world that makes them think in a more sophisticated manner, in a way that's immensely enjoyable and totally unpredictable. Because if you read a medieval fantasy, for example, you pretty much know what you're going to get. You're waiting for the sword fights. Swords, horses, arrows, you know what that is. Western, same thing. You're basically waiting for the gunfights. But with a 19th century story, you don't know what's going to happen, because it can go in so many different directions.
Oh, yeah.
All you know is that the people are going to speak in a very sophisticated manner, and that they dress well. But you don't know, like, is this going to be art? Is this going to go into romance? Are we going to learn something about history? Are we going to do some science?
Oh, yeah.
And in that, I found, with steampunk, I think that's really unique among genres. Because if you're in a space opera, it's okay, we get it. Like, we're in space and there's all the machinery that comes with it. But steampunk can go anywhere at any time. And I think a child's mind also works that way. A child's mind makes connections that adults tend not to make, because we become more conscious and linear. And I kept finding that kids were really interested in, like, oh, now I'm over here, and I've got a question about that, and I've got a question about that. And so writing Little Wayne Watchtower, I found that was really one of the most amazing things about young readers, is never underestimate them, because they want to make connections and insights, which I describe an insight as when you link two things together that you didn't realize were actually linked. And I find that kids, with the right amount of encouragement, can do an incredible amount of insight. They can connect one thing to the other. They can read a ghost story, and then that can teach them about physics, or they can read a book about a young girl trying to take down gangs and learn a lot about their own lives and stuff like that. So that's been really special to experience that. And I credit the genre with creating that environment, that ecosystem, for that kind of exploration to occur.
Yeah. Senior in the chat says, once you hear steampunk, you can expect goggles, top hats, and gears. But here, and this is why I often make a distinction between. For me, like, people ask you, well, what is steampunk? And I said, well, actually, it means three different things. You've got the genre, what we're now discussing. Then you've got the community, what he's now referencing, and then you've got, like, the broad aesthetic, right? And the thing with, like, for me, why I love steampunk, it's a wonderful visual storytelling tool. Right, that's what I love about it. The using the visuals for your storytelling and creating metaphors, like the giant lantern is kind of like is a good example of that. And in the community, like, has a lot of tropes, which is the top ears, gears, and goggles, because it's a bit of shame. You often hear people say, "Well, I didn't know I was steampunk." Until I thought until people told me so, which is a thing you often hear. I can probably say the same for for the things that I did in my youth. Like as a child, I build imaginary cities from printing boards, circuit boards, and. So it's that thing, and I think H.G. Wells thought the same thing. Teaching science through science fiction. Yes. I mean, the wonderful thing about science fiction, like, steampunk is a mixture of alternate history and science fiction. So I'm an historian, so I love to, for my own book, I love to research like all the historical things, like, oh, they're encountering this. Oh, how does that work? And you start researching, and before you know, it's like 3 a.m. in the evening, and then you're still on the internet looking for information. But you also have like the science fiction parts, like how does technology work? Like, what technology can they use to make this effective? What did they already have? So one things that are common in my world are electric cars, because they already had those.
Yeah.
So that's a lot of stuff that I did not know. Something that I want to write more about is the West Africa Squadron. Is something very few people know very little about.
Yeah.
Um, you were
I think
joking.
for
Okay.
me, yeah, I remember with with Jules Verne, for example, in the mysterious island, they had these guns that fired these balls that if they struck you, they would shock you, and they were essentially stun guns.
Right.
And I remember that he actually has several paragraphs in which he describes exactly how the mechanism worked, and that was when I learned the difference between amperes and voltage and current, for example. And also, there's a lot of geological information, basalt and other types of rock that he describes. I think both in The Mysterious Island and 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea is where I learned about various kinds of pressures and how submersibles work. And I think that what's amazing to me is when you do a bit of research, you find out something. We sort of take history for granted in a lot of ways in the modern age, where we forget that people discovered the things that we use today.
Oh, yeah.
People
Yeah.
had to discover them through trial and error. And if you go back to the 19th century, you go back to that's when X-rays were invented, and that's when all these other things were done that we just
Yeah.
take for granted now. And so you can go back to a time when they were still magical and mysterious, and then you can insert them into a narrative. And this happens with Abigail when she's on her adventure with Little Wade and Watchtower. She comes into contact with technology that we now know exists. We know we use it every day, but for her it's, oh wow, this is amazing. Miniaturization and electricity and all these other things that
Yeah.
nowadays we take for granted. But back then, again, this goes back to this idea of innocence and engineering. This idea that there's something magical about the ability to visit these things for the first time when they were first created, and how amazing now the things that we describe as mundane are, like the telephone, for example, or the telegraph. For example, Watchtower, the mechanical man, he communicates by essentially tapping his fingers together, and then a letter pops up and it's a telegram, right?
Right.
And it's a funny, cute way of doing that, but what it does is it reinforces the idea that, like, oh, this was a thing, this was the way to do it. And then in the later books, when she picks up the telephone for the first time, there's a sense of awe and wonder to it, and then you insert a little bit about, well, this is how telephones work. And nowadays we don't think about that. We don't think about this, and we should, because a transmission through a wavelength, through this, and all of a sudden you're actually reintroducing kids to the concept of magic in a very grounded, very grounded terms. And this leads to the third theme about reinvention, which is this idea that, again, with thinking about my brother, thinking about troubled kids, thinking about teachers that are trying to reach kids who maybe aren't readers, this idea of you can reinvent yourself. I think a lot of the best steampunk stories deal with this idea of reinvention, that
Yeah.
things have not worked out the way that I want or that I planned. But now, through a combination of my own innocence, my own engineering, my own ingenuity, my own courage, my own bravery, I can find a way to discover my own version of alternate history. What else can I be? And that to me was, aside from because the aesthetic for me is so interesting. It's anachronistic in some ways, but in a beautiful way. It's the sense of the old ways still matter. But when you look at someone who's dressed or who adopts the steampunk aesthetic, what's very interesting is there's this kind of unpredictability about it. You don't know where they're going to go. You don't know what they're going to say. And I think that there's something perpetually kind of undefined about it. And I think that's it's very childlike in the most beautiful sense. And I think that what it does is it's this idea of, and every steampunk that I spoke to, conventions I went to, etc., always had a story about, well, I was going to do this. I was working in this field, but then I discovered steampunk, and now I'm actually working in this field, or I'm doing something else. Every story was about someone quite literally switching gears and discovering, sort of hitting a bit of a wall in their current life, but then suddenly shifting over to this alternative way of thinking, and then suddenly opening up a whole new range of possibilities.
Oh man, I mean,
and
all the things that I've learned through steampunk, like streaming, photoshopping, crafting, writing, organizing. I mean, I mean, you know, it turned me into a genuine creative. That and the fun. One of the things is like. One of the benefits of steampunk, and why I think even if you're not into steampunk, you can still appreciate it because of A, it has historical references. For the geeks, it has pop culture references. And it has a lot of moving parts, which is very nice for the boys, and the girls have pretty dresses to look at. So you're ticking all the, you know, you trigger all those positive things in people. Because of its variety and its source of inspiration, which for me is like pop culture.
No,
and
I'm really glad you mentioned that, because when I was building Little Wade and Watchtower, I imagined this is a book that the protagonist, Abigail, is female. She's a young girl. She's 13 years old. Everything is told through her point of view. So if you're a young female reader, it's really a story about a young girl who's lost her mother, whose father works 3 jobs, who's poor, who's in a new city, she's afraid. But she then learns to reinvent herself with the help of these 2 supernatural friends of hers, who are really just hidden in plain sight. I mean, Watchtower is capable of disguising himself as a lamppost. That's quite literally what he does. She runs right past him, okay, and he turns and looks at her, and then the gang comes after her, and then, you know, they manage to rescue her. This is just the first scene. But this idea of what I've learned with all the beta readers that I had before I released the book was the girls loved it because it was Abigail's arc, where she learned that she's far more capable than she ever imagined. She's far braver than she ever could be. And she learns to start to think about, okay, well, I can't be this person. My mother is gone. She passed away. I can't live in the country anymore. I'm in the city now. It's time for me to become a New Yorker. But then on the other side of it, what you get is the boys love Little Wade and love Watchtower, because they bring all of the sort of the excitement and the hijinks and everything else, and all the adventure. Watchtower is the brawn, Little Wade is the brain. Little Wade does all the talking. Watchtower is kind of the strong, silent type. So it's a nice balance.
Are they kind of like Jay and Silent Bob? Do they have that?
That's exactly correct. Yes, only Silent Bob is really tall. He's 8 feet tall. He can crank up to 14 feet tall or 21 feet tall.
Yeah.
And if you come across Watchtower and he's 21 feet tall, you're in trouble, because he gets bigger and stronger every time. And Little Wade is this boy who represents, in many ways, like Abigail, they bond because Little Wade died when he was very young. He never got a chance to live. And so he comes to them, and he's been around now since 1831. Abigail and the Great Gang Trap is set in 1899. So they've been doing this for a while. So when she proceeds forward into this world, they have a whole lot of resources that they can bring to help her out. Unfortunately, that also means that they have a lot of enemies too. Yeah. But there's a nice balance between sort of girl readers and boy readers. Everyone. Really, there's really something for everybody. I mean, that was sort of how I built it, and I think steampunk does a very good job of accommodating that, because what you have is this moment where there's obviously a lot of tension with gender roles. A lot of things were changing very, very rapidly. Even before women actually got the right to vote, there was a lot of rapid change going on that was leading towards that. You had female scientists, you had female doctors, you had female nurses, you had female explorers. You had all kinds of women that were breaking boundaries before the big one broke. And that's really interesting, because there's that tension, there's antagonism, but there's a tremendous amount of inspiration. Yeah. And you know as well as I do, doing historical research, you throw a stone and you'll find like Nellie Bly or Mary Curie or any one of these incredible women that are doing really revolutionary things, and it's very easy to come up with a character based upon them, or they run into them in real life. It's really pretty extraordinary.
Yeah, well, one of the things about the 19th century, and you know, there are a lot of negative stereotypes about the 19th century, and some are completely justified. However, what people do not understand about the 19th century is that, you know, people always talk about, oh, the working conditions and this and that. But what people do not understand is that we came out of a pre-industrial society. And we had to make up all these new rules because there were never been that many people in the cities. The cities were cities didn't used to grow naturally by themselves before then. It was like you were born on the countryside, and then you moved to the city, and then you'll probably die there. And that's how the cities remained populated. Because, you know, they didn't grow. They were just basically, some call them parasites on the countryside. Because, you know, agriculture was where it's at, and the cities were there, well, because they were required for trade and stuff like that. Then all of a sudden, you know, those structures were broken down. People moved to the cities in like unprecedented numbers, because that's where the jobs were now, which was also new. You know, now you used to have like Vampany companies. Those turned into like factories with hundreds of employees, and we did not know how to handle that. So, you know, and
mass production, exactly.
You know,
this gets back to this idea of the birth of these institutions that we now take for granted.
Yeah.
And everything from, like, I mean, I mentioned the police and the fire department and anything else before, but now you're talking about big business and mass production. But what that does, what's interesting is it makes, and when I was writing Little Wade and Watchtower, I realized that all of the themes are still relevant today. Immigration, still relevant today. Working conditions and class differences, rich versus poor, and people working too hard for not enough, still relevant today. Families that suffer because of the working conditions or because of their class, still relevant today. Crime on the streets, gangs in various neighborhoods in New York or any city, still relevant today. The Gilded Age, everything going on in the Gilded Age, these incredibly opulent aristocrats that are able to lead these incredible lives, but people living in squalor that are actually helping the city going.
Well, to be honest, you wouldn't want to trade your current lifestyle with that of an aristocrat from those days.
Yeah, that's true.
So,
exactly.
It's a bit relative, but like I said, we didn't know the rules. All these rules needed to make up, and like in an extremely, I mean, think about that. We had like what 9,000, 6,000 years of agricultural society, and all of a sudden that changed within 100 years. 6,000 years of human progress.
Really was a revolution.
So, and people.
What that does is that gives you that's great antagonism, right? That's great. Your villains, your people who are in charge, they have really strong points of view. They're building things. They're not trying to destroy the world. They're trying to build a new one. And as a result, it's really interesting when Abigail runs into gangsters and then the people behind the gangsters and everything else. She runs into people that have really strong points of view. New York is on its way to becoming one of the greatest cities in the world. And she realizes that there are people that are trying to build that. And they have a very interesting idea about what's acceptable, about what's an acceptable cost. And what it does is it creates an incredible tension, and it asks some really, really good questions. Even for young readers, I found that kids were like, "This is really cool." Like that character that we're sort of fighting against just made a really good point.
Now, I would suggest you read, if you haven't already. Read The Road to Wigan Pier by George Orwell, which is my favorite book by his. People know him from 1984, but The Road of Wigan Pier is like his. He was a journalist back then. This was before he went to Spain to fight in the Civil War that inspired 1984. And you know what he describes in that book of how people lived, and you're like. Gee, like he also like describes like the behavior of the working class, not just like the horrible conditions they live in, but also their own behavior. And it's like, oh, they already ate too much sugary foods back then. It's like all these problems. They never like, oh. But one thing he also mentioned, like he also liked to build things. He would have made a fine steampunk, I think. But he also liked to work with his hands. But he worked, but he describes like, yeah, about capitalism and stuff like that. And then he's like, yeah, but the problem is, like, I like to make things. I make my own furniture. But the thing is, if I were living in a different society, I wouldn't be able to do what I do because the nails. Just a simple nail. What kind of complex logistical network there is behind the fabrication of a single nail? How do you fabricate that in a post-apocalypse society? Yeah.
And you touch on something because you mentioned the genre, the community, and the aesthetic. Switching to the community for a second. The thing that I stumbled upon when I was really doing a deep dive to steampunk, when I was writing Little Wade and Watchtower, and I wanted to put it into the books, and I'm going to, book 1, book 2, and book 3, is this idea of right to repair and repairing things and engineering things. And this idea that when we get too far away from knowing, first of all, where our food comes from, agriculturally, there's a distance there, but also too far away from where our technology comes from. And I learned a lot about these people that were capable of repairing their computers and repairing their phones and repairing things. And there's a lot of tension between them and large corporations that obviously don't want that. They want to keep selling you things. Yeah. But I think that's a really interesting. That's an interesting way that steampunk is importing itself into the real world. This idea of I want to repair and renew what I have. I don't just want to get a new version of everything. And this, when I was writing the books with Little Wade, Watchtower, and Abigail and their adventures, one of the big things that I really loved about writing steampunk, especially for young readers, was that Abigail, despite having the assistance of a ghost and of a mechanical man, she still has to reason things out. There's no computers, there's no calculators, there's no Google, there's no easy fix. You have to use your wits. And I feel like steampunk does a really great job of keeping that tension that balance between the human imagination and technology. And what I'm doing personally in my own life is I'm trying to start working on like building small computers and doing things myself to kind of improve my balance between my mind and the machines that I'm using. Because I feel like that was in some ways steampunk is almost like the golden age, right when the human intellect and the mechanistic, the technology that we create, we're sort of working hand in hand. Now it's the human intellect does something, and then most people, for example, they use technology that is radically more sophisticated than their understanding. And I think to myself, you know what? It'd be really interesting if you have the steampunk movement when it comes to technology, and at the same time, the number of steampunks that I met that were also organic farmers that were trying to get back to more of a balanced sense of where their food came from as well. They're just trying to get a sense of, once upon a time, we had a much clearer sense of growing our own food and then ingesting it and having a much clearer relationship. Now it's very, very fragmented. It's very distant.
Oh, God. A lot of people.
I wonder.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of people, they don't even know where milk comes from.
Exactly. And this was interesting when I was writing the book, when I was thinking very deeply about it. I had this girl, this ghost, this watchtower, and they're doing all this stuff. It forced me to think about how distant. And you're writing a book, which is a really old-fashioned technology, which is really interesting. It's a person's mind printed on paper, which can then be disseminated across space and time. It's really cool. And I just thought to myself, it made me think a lot about balancing, having a clearer sense of my relationship with both the artificial, technological world around me and the natural world.
Yeah,
and I think that I saw that. in
Yeah.
kids
Oh,
that read it as well.
it's a funny. I think it was last week. I thought about this about it was International Steampunk Day 2 days ago, July 14th.
Yeah.
And because of the difference engine, and I was thinking about the difference engine. I don't care about the book. And I also tried listening to Neuromancer. I am just not a fan of Gibson. I mean, I know he's like, oh, the big guy who created all the cyberpunk genre, and in some, well, he formalized the steampunk genre. But I'm just not a fan of his work. But then I thought about, like, I have listened to his interviews, and then he described like how he worked on a typewriter. And how that process went, and I'm like, I could not do that. I'm dyslexic. I need the digital age. I could not have written the book that I have. That's off to the publishers today. If I for the readers or for the viewers who are watching the screen right now, this is the cover design, not the eventual cover, but the cover design by Star Ranger. It looks awesome. One of the publishers I reached out today was a bit concerned about it for some reason, so we'll see what's up with that. So that's going to be a whole new adventure for me. But yeah, my point was that I would be completely lost if I had to write on a normal typewriter, and I trained on those typewriters, and now no one would like, why would you train on traditional typewriters?
Yeah, it's interesting because what's interesting about typewriters is because I've used them as well, and especially when I was trying to type out, when Watchtower communicates, I tried to type those out to sort of get a sense of the economies of words and stuff like that. And what's interesting is, in the case of the typewriter, it's interesting because I find that my mind goes much faster than I can type it down and set down, and I find that I make more errors now, and I have to kind of go back and with Microsoft Word or with Pages or whatever I use, or Vellum for the when I'm doing books. I find that I race ahead, and then I have to go back and kind of fix things, because that's the way my mind works now.
Yeah.
Whereas I think with the typewriter, you have to be very, very thoughtful and deliberate. You have to think, and then I'm going to type this. I have to think, I have to type this, and it was interesting, just for that one moment, to ponder, okay, if you had to think before you generated content, as opposed to you can't go back easily and fix it, what does that do? And this brought me back to a teacher that I had when I was studying at Oxford about Shakespeare, which was the thing about Shakespeare, which makes it really interesting, and this also happens in the 19th century as well, is the narratives are very interesting because they involve characters debate, deliberate, and then they decide. And that often drives the narrative in just about all of Shakespeare's plays, and also in the 19th century. Yeah. Characters grapple over an issue, they have really good dialogue about it, and then they make a decision, and there are consequences. And it really is like the plot is typing itself out. It's you think about it, and then you go, and there's no turning back. Whereas I think nowadays, with like super fast-paced stuff that we have nowadays, sometimes they're just like racing ahead, and there's like plot holes everywhere. But it's like, don't worry about it. Just enjoy the show, because we're sort of flying past it.
Yeah.
But I found writing this book that I was like, no, you know what? Let me think hard about this. Like, and it became imperative because Little Wade and Watchtower are trying to help a young girl live a better life. So they are not going to do a bad job. They're not going to like lead her into danger recklessly. So they're going to have to think, and then plan ahead, and then work. And that was a very interesting sort of psychology to get into.
One of the most important phrases, because I also give writing courses on my Discord for people new to writing or who want to write for the Association of Ishtar. And one of the most important phrases by, I'm not sure if you're familiar with Jordan Peterson, but one of the most important things he once said to, like, a guy in the audience asked, like, what should I do? I want to do this. What should I do? And then Jordan Peterson said, learn to write. because you learn to structure your thought. And I had a discussion with a guy from, well, I will not say where he's from because I'm not sure if he's even allowed to be on Discord, but, you know, he wants to be a game designer. And he asked me a question like, well, this situation, how do you think, what would that work for you? And I said, okay, well, let's go through this. Okay, what's my situation? You know, you know, what's my relation with my parents? What is this? What is that? You know, just ask question after question after question. You know, don't. You know, sure, ask a big question, but, you know, reduce it to small questions, and then, okay, how can those questions be answered in the context of a story? You know, and one of the feedback I got, I made the mistake of showing my manuscript to a professional writer, and for some reason she thought it was fantastic. Her words, not mine. And, you know, she said, well, you really take, like, the you know, the protagonist really takes the reader on the hand. That's because, you know, instead of, like, introducing, like, 9 characters on page 1, that's something that my previous guest mentioned, you know, it's like, okay, let's confront a character with this situation, and that situation, and that situation. Like, and how does he go? How does he confront all those things? And, you know, what does that escalate to? Because when you have answered so many questions, you know, there's going to be a big question for me, you know, and that's, you know, that is where he has to show his mettle. And if that fails, like, you know, everything just collapses. Because, you know, he's not consistent, or he has not learned anything, which is also a possibility. I mean, Beavis and Butthead, they don't learn anything from their adventures.
No, they don't. A lot of comedic characters don't, and that's the fun part. Or they do, and it's too late, but hopefully they get forgiven by the end. It's interesting. But this idea of inquiry is also leads me to another discovery that I made when I was working on Little Wade and Watchtower, was to get into more of an old-fashioned dialogic sense. You get into this idea of legitimate inquiry, right? Kids like to ask questions a lot, and once you start asking questions, as a writer, you have to start answering them. And what that does is that gives you the bones and the skeleton for a story that has very strong internal consistency. Because when you have a young person, I like to write protagonists. I like to write stories from one protagonist's point of view. I just like to keep it, especially for young readers for ages 10 to 13. I'm like, you know what? Let me just focus on Abigail, because what that does is it's a discovery. There's a perpetual discovery. That's what I decided to do, and I found that it worked out. And then what was interesting was Abigail is, there's stuff that she knows. There's her backstory, but then there's all the questions that she has, not just externally facing her external obstacles, but her internal ones as well. And I find that as a writer, when you figure out what are the external questions the character is asking, and then what are the internal questions that they're asking, what you find is if you ask those and try to answer those, the plot sort of moves forward in a way that's engaging, because it's the way that we think anyway, and it's certainly the way that we used to think all the time when we were children. And if you read a book that makes you feel childlike in that way, well, you're asking, like, why? What's going on? What do I do now? What if I can't do it? You know, what if I fail? Oh, but, you know, what can I do to not fail? And suddenly you put a reader, I think, in a really exciting frame of mind. Where,
well, let me
getting back to this idea when things were new.
Yeah, let me tell you a little bit about something about my specialty when I studied history used to be medieval. And one of the things that medieval philosophers, writers, clerics would do, they had the Scholastic Method. And in the Scholastic Method, what they basically would do, instead of, you know, as we all were used to, like, you just describe, like, the process from your point of view in a scientific work, they created characters. And they would maul, and those characters would maul over... actually, this is the reason why Galileo got locked up, by the way. So let's take the example of Galileo, like where he discussed, like, what was it, the sun and heliocentrism. What Galileo did and why he got locked up was, like, the Pope asked him to write like his defense, his treatise on heliocentrism. And what Galileo did, and I think he did this intentionally, by the way. I think he wanted to become a martyr, but that's my interpretation. Is that like he wrote like a master, a student, and a complete idiot who represented like his opposition. So you had the master who explained his point of view, then he had the student say, well, this is the counter argument, how do you respond to that? And then you had, well, let's say the Pope, who was a complete moron, who then like created a complete straw man of the church position on heliocentrism.
Right.
And I mean, this is a very interesting method because, especially nowadays, you see like a lot of philosophies that do not even allow a counter word to just say, well, it's if you say that, it's just this ism. So, haha, you're debunked now. It's like, okay, it's but that.
Yeah, it's dominance. It's dominance. It's not debate and deliberation and decision. And that's you raise a really excellent point. I'm noticing now more and more in television shows today and everything else, it's all about a person who knows everything comes in and kind of smacks down someone else. Like let me show you how smart I am. And there's no counterpoint, and then they come to it.
It's all about breaking people down.
Unfortunately, they're missing out because the 19th century steampunk does that all the time. And that's what makes steampunk exciting. Was that was sort of almost like it's like the old ways, right? Like the old rhetorical way of where even Sherlock Holmes and Watson would debate. Even Sherlock Holmes, who was sort of the beginning of that kind of smug know-it-all archetype. Now, Watson would ask him questions, and Sherlock Holmes would have to. He even says at one point, I think in one of the stories, "I enjoy this. I like this. I like this idea of you're asking me questions. The Socratic method, right? You're asking me questions, and all.
Right? Yeah, indeed, the Socratic method. Yeah.
It generates creativity.
And that's what they did in the medieval era. It's extremely interesting because the questions they're asking, they're not simple questions. And even on things like the question of God, and it's like, well, even like medieval clerics were like, yeah, well, he does not exist, and yet he does exist. Like, Schrodinger's God, basically. So it's extremely interesting to read. I'm a big fan of Bernardus of Clairvaux, for instance. I didn't even know I would like the guy, but he was basically the one who defended the Templars, like the creation of the Templars, this idea of warrior monks. And he's an extremely interesting character because when you look at his life, like he is this guy from a family of mercenaries, essentially of knights. And, he goes into the religious order with the same military mentality. So he's like, basically becomes Al-Qaeda, a peaceful Al-Qaeda. He even refuses to eat. They had to force feed him lettuce to keep him alive. And then, as he grows older, you see him mature in his writings. You see him mature as a human being. You see, like, I want to live as a monk. But my calling is that I go into the world, which is something that monks are not supposed to do. So he's also like one of the, not the founder, but one of the main people about the Cisterciensers, which were like the first monastic order that really solved a long-standing problem of monastic life, which was monks are not supposed to go to the world. And the Cisterciensers says, okay, you've got guys, they want to be monks. Let them be monks. However, let there also be guys who want to work in the fields. And, they have a different status. They're not monks, but they are still part of the order. They still have their religious life. And then you've got the guys, they want to be medics. Okay, well, let them be medics. They're not monks, but they're still part of the religious order. And, and then, so they had like this entire economy within their monastic order. It also made them incredibly rich because they also like had guys who ruled like their trade fleets. It was insane. But like and Clairvaux, Bernardus of Clairvaux, he really wanted to be a monk. That was his goal, to live in solitude and just pray all day and pray for people's souls. That was his goal. But he became like the spokesperson. He went from this place to that place, and it was like, But in his own writings, in his own words, like, yes, I want to be a monk, but this is what God chose for me. This is what I must do. And that kind of like the whole Templar thing is a bit of an embarrassment for him because it is very clear. There's this his defense for the Templar starts. Well, this is the third time you wrote me about this. Fine. That's how he starts his letter. This is the third time you wrote me about this. Okay, you can have your stupid Templar order. That's basically the stretch of the letter.
Fine. Found an order that will change the world.
Yeah, well, there's actually a letter recovered from him in which he literally says, "Well, I'm glad they're over there and not here," because the Templars and basically what led to their eventual downfall was basically they became like a penance order for like the unruly elite. So it was like, oh, you're a bad knight. Just join the Templars, please, and so it's.
Yeah, that also happened with the because I'm doing another historical fiction fantasy now, of more for adults, and I discovered it's the same thing with the samurai. The samurai rose to power. You had the original samurai that rose to power based upon their exploits, and then the next generation you had sort of the children of those samurai, some of whom either surpassed their parents, but many who did not sort of meet their parents' exploits because they came at a different time. And then, unfortunately, then you have the ones that kind of bought their way into the samurai orders. And so what you get is you get several different generations, and the organization sort of falls apart. It forgets what it originally was. But your thing about Monk Plus is really interesting because it also ties into something else that I think was blossoming specifically in the 19th century, which was this idea of you have more than one nature. Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde. All of the different, in fact, it would be Crime and Punishment, Dostoevsky, where you have more than one person inside of you, and there's a dialogue and a debate between them as you try to figure out who you want to be. There's sort of this.
A short interruption. Something also interesting. Something also interesting about medieval people is that they probably had a far better memory than we did because they had to remember everything. So they were probably slower, but they had memories of elephants.
Yeah, I mean that's very interesting because it reminds you again that if that really good storytelling involves memory, a character having a significant backstory that affects their internal debate and dialogue that they have, not just with external debates with other characters, but also internally within them. And then the decisions that are the result of that then move forward and push the plot forward in a way where it solves a lot of issues in terms of, well, does the plot make sense or not? Well, yeah, it does make sense because we've been there in that person's mind. We've been there as they try to grapple with their decisions, rational, irrational, good, bad, light, dark, fear versus courage, all these conflicts. And I found that kids, students are having these conflicts. They're having these things. They're dealing with their little mini backstories because a lot of them are younger, obviously. But at the same time, because you haven't lived quite as long, every year, every day counts so much more in so many ways. The longer you live, right, you have a longer backstory, but you sort of look at things in kind of a much longer perspective. But kids, there are these little moments in their lives that we, as older people look back and say, okay, well, that's one of many. They're like, no, it's not a constellation. This is like my sort of my North Star in some ways. And I find that kids are doing a lot of it. They're doing a lot of this active thinking. Their memories are rapidly accumulating everything because they're trying to figure out who they are. And I think it's a really interesting, between the kind of the medieval aesthetic, sort of the medieval Renaissance aesthetic, which you're describing, which is really amazing, and then between that and our ultra modern aesthetic, where a lot of things are disposable, things are very, very fast paced, we don't remember a lot. Technology is in many ways a crutch for us. technology in some ways is kind of running away with us. There's this
Wouldn't it
steampunk
be
in the middle, the
interesting?
ultimate bridge, right?
Wouldn't it be interesting to have like the medieval, like let's say you have a cathedral builder, like what those guys put together. I mean, we say, well, that's obsolete technology, but they put that together by hand. They used hand
Yeah.
cranes and horsepower, and they put that together, right? With
Over generations, and that's the thing. It's people would live and die, and the work is unfinished, but the work is ongoing.
yeah,
It's a very interesting way of looking at generations, a way of looking at art and architecture, and again, building something to last, which is something that I think steampunk has that tension where
Yeah.
it's new technology and building something to last, building something that you can repair. For example, you can have a cathedral builder in a steampunk setting, right? But nowadays, it seems like everything is not built to last. It's built to last for a little bit, and then we upgrade and we trade it. We trade it.
yeah.
And that
Oh,
I
God.
think I'm not sure. Yeah, I mean, I think getting back to Gibson, I think Gibson's a great introducer of like little concepts like that, and I think his one thing that I think is interesting because I listen to his interviews as well, is he also mentioned that he was concerned about the kind of disposability culture.
Yeah, yeah.
Which-
Well,
and-
a matter of fact, he
steampunk,
said
I
about
think
his own work that he was afraid that the metaphors didn't make sense anymore, because he at some point describes in the first sentences of Neuromancer, he describes like TV static.
Yeah,
I have seen children on events who don't know what a classic telephone, how a classic telephone works. Like they see the turning down,
Exactly.
they're like, I don't understand. I just this work.
exactly. Yeah, I was. What's funny is right before you mentioned like some of the first lines of Neuromancer, I was going to say the same thing. It's a wonderful line. It's where he's describing the sky as the color of something with that a person has a hand on a fast forward button. It's that kind of
Yeah,
that,
something like that.
weird,
Yeah.
shaky thing that we all remember if we were in that generation about what that was like.
Oh, man.
But kids wouldn't understand it today. And I think that I wonder if there's an opportunity, for example, and I have discovered this pleasantly when I was writing Little Wade and Watchtower and having kids read it, was they appreciated learning about, like when they learned about what a telegraph was. And they're like,
Yeah.
oh yeah, that's like a primitive email. And I said, yes. And they were like, oh, and what one girl, when she was awfully cute. She was like, the email has ancestors. And I was like, yes. And that was definitely one of the funnier exchanges I had. And it's true because what you can do, there's an opportunity with steampunk to build that bridge to our young people to the past in an entertaining way. So they look back on it with that kind of fondness, where they're like, oh yeah, I read that book where people went around in carriages and where telephones were more primitive, but they were more magical in a lot of ways. Or the first calculator was like this big machine that you had to type into. And that way, when the kids are using their own technology, they're like, oh, just like when we read or watch fantasy, medieval fantasy, we're watching affectionately swords and armor and horses and stuff. We're watching old-fashioned material that helps us deal with old-fashioned
That's how I started
emotions.
actually
And
medieval reenactment. Yeah. We also missed.
Yeah,
let's also go to the chat for a moment, because some gentleman has been leaving us some messages that we've been ignoring. The trope in storytelling is to call the mundane. Is called mundane made awesome. Well, that's show don't tell for me. Up to a point we are dealing with global. Oh yeah, that's fine. Private investigators will be missed. They have a certain romantic atmosphere to them. Steam Boy illustrates change really good. Yes, it does. Steam Boy is. It's an interesting film. I enjoyed it most when watched in 2 sittings. But yeah, it's an interesting film for sure. I actually made a 2-part
There's also
review of that.
generational conflict in Steam Boy. That was what was interesting to me. Was if I'm remembering it correctly, there's the young one, and then there's the father and the grandfather.
Yes.
Very
That's
interesting.
with Jean-Luc Picard is the grandfather. Yeah. Onto that point, science goes
really interesting about it. Yeah.
On the point, science goes both ways, which are explored in Steam Boys. Some humans will either twist or make destructive and warlike innovations. Yeah, absolutely. Also, even for that part, war has also been a great a great cause for innovation as well. Rubber tires, for instance, I know, and nylon, I think, as well.
What is it? War is the one area where it is acceptable to experiment on humans, right?
Yeah,
I mean,
essentially.
we experiment on animals in all of our industries. War is where we can experiment on each other.
Yeah. Remember Wall-E, the scene where the captain didn't understand how books worked? I am reminded of a sketch about the opposite situation where a scribe needs to explain to a monk how books work because the monk was accustomed to scrolls. And he needed to explain, well, this is a book. You flip the pages forward. But what if I want to go back? Well, you just flip the page back.
No, you need to understand. This is better. This is better. Right? It's like no more. I mean, it's a little heavier, but it's better. It'll last longer. Right?
Well, I mean, if you look at the size of such scrolls, I doubt if it is better. To be honest.
Right. Yeah.
Okay, well, we are over an hour now in our conversation. I'm enjoying this greatly. Let's wrap this up. If you ever want to talk about anything at all, just let me know. We also do a movie review podcast. So if there are some movie classics you think, oh, those are really inspirational to me, we can talk about those as well. I like to end these podcasts on some words of wisdom from our guest. So, do you have something to share with us tonight?
Actually. There's a moment in Little Wade and Watchtower, Abigail and the Great Gang Trap, where she walks into a bookstore and Little Wade has set aside a book for her. And it's a book from one of their previous clients who has become a great explorer. And what Little Wade tells her, he gives it to her and he says, when life is unfair, then that is your opportunity to do something unexpected. And that is your opportunity to become someone extraordinary.
I think those are very fine words.
And she takes that to heart and does some pretty amazing things.
All right. I think those are very good words to end on. So, ladies and gentlemen, I hope you enjoyed this podcast. I sure did. Let us know if you've got questions for our guests. Leave them down in the comments. If you want, join the Discord. I do have to change the link of the Discord because apparently there was a problem with Discord with servers getting attacked by something. So we had to change thanks to our moderator, we changed the address. So I need to adjust that on all my videos. Anyway. In my own news, I sent my manuscript off to some publishers. I'm looking for more publishers who might be interested. I managed to find one in the Netherlands who might be interested. So I hope to hear that very early next month.
We've established, I think, today, several times during our conversation about how valuable and how necessary this genre is, and how it needs to be discovered and rediscovered all the time, because it really does contain, more than any other genre, infinite possibility.
Yeah. Well, my personal issue is that I'm a Dutch guy who decided to write in English because most of his viewers are in the United States. So it made no sense in that regard to write in Dutch. But if there is enough ammo for it, I might get it translated. Because English is just the language in which I speak and write. So, yeah. Of course, people, there are a lot of stories that are hit on the topics that we discussed today. So if you enjoyed it, go check out the Association of Ishtar. Pandora's Mirror in particular, which I happened to reread today. And I actually enjoy my own stories. So, but enough about that. Yeah, where can they find your work?
Little Wade and Watchtower, Abigail and the Great Gang Trap is available on Amazon and on Smashworks, both paperback and ebook.
Okay, awesome. And with that, thank you to Sean for being here, and to all you people in the chat, thank you for participating. And as always, make things your way. Good night.